Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us on KTV Primetime News. Now, time for our discussion, of course, talking about the climate action revolving around the COP27 that is going on in Egypt. Now, nations, activists, experts, and leaders are gathering in the Egyptian town of Sharm, el-Sheikh, for the UN climate negotiations. From the previous COP meetings, it appears that there are several unmet climate commitments from the highly emitting nations towards mitigating climate change effects. Amidst the global financial recessions, what is the position of Africa in climate action, and will the COP27 really count for Africa in the negotiations? And that generally forms the basis of our discussion tonight. Joining me is Barbra Khatinya, who is an environmentalist and a climate change activist. Thank you so much, Barbra, for dedicating your time for this discussion. All right, Barbra, so we get the ball rolling, and the conversation right now across the globe is revolving around the COP27, and maybe we could start by you shedding light on what exactly is this COP27, and how does it work, and probably you tell us what is the significance of the COP27 to our nation, Kenya.
Thank you very much. I feel delighted to be here to talk about current issues. So COP27 is actually the 27th Conference of Parties on Climate Change. So it comes from COP. COP is the decision-making body of the UNFCCC, which means United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Like, just to mention, most times in the climate space we experience really technical terms, and disclaimer, you might hear one or two. Yeah.
So, right. So now tell us, what is the significance of this COP? What is the significance of COP, and how is it important for us as Kenyans as it's something that is happening in our continent, Africa, in Egypt?
So the COP, or the Conference of Parties, is very, very important because during its formation it had 4 goals. The first one was to keep the global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The next is to mobilize finance, and then adapt and protect communities and natural life. And the final one was to try and mitigate and work together to deliver all these goals. So it becomes very, very important because Kenya is one of the countries that is very, very vulnerable and is experiencing one of the worst impacts of climate change. It's actually a frontline country when it comes to these effects of climate change. So the Conference of Parties being a conference where global leaders come together and talk about these issues that could affect our future, these issues about climate change, which is a crisis that's there right now, which is actually an emergency, then it becomes very, very important and very significant for our country at the moment.
All right. So it's noteworthy that you say that there are a number of COP conferences that have been held before. So maybe just to borrow from the previous COP conferences that have been held before. So what are some of the milestones of these COP meetings, of these COP summits, to understand the significance of the COP summits? So what are some of the milestones that have been witnessed following the previous COP meetings that we have had across the world?
Well, being the 27th, it's been 30 years since it all began, and I'll just maybe mention the most recent. So I will talk about maybe the Kyoto Protocol, which was, because it involves finance, which was in 1997, sorry. So it was about the highest emitting countries are supposed to pay for their emissions too. So the more you emit, the more you pay for it. So that was one maybe significant step. The next was in 2015, which was when the Paris Agreement came about. It was the issue concerning global temperatures. So initially, we were not supposed to exceed 2 degrees Celsius, but according to the Paris Agreement, we were advised to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then that was in 2015. And then fast forward to last year, COP26, where we had the Paris Handbook. So the Paris Agreement was just like a set of just words. But when we had the handbook, it's like breaking it down and explaining how we're supposed to achieve the goals in the Paris Agreement, like how every country can do it. It talks about the hows. And then also in COP26, we also had the Glasgow Climate Pact, which also talked more about the finance and the mitigation, adaptation, and how countries can scale up their nationally determined contributions and try and adjust them like every 2 years and try and keep up with the climate crisis.
All right. Now, let us now try to drive this point home, talking about effects, the adverse effects of climate change. So I believe that climate change is has been responsible for the extreme weather conditions and disasters that are so catastrophic. We saw the flooding in Pakistan, drought that has been witnessed across parts of Africa. So maybe to make people really understand the importance of climate actions, what are some of the dangers of climate change that we are witnessing? There are some things we are witnessing and people don't really know that they are results of climate change. So what are some of these dangers of climate change to make people really know that we are witnessing this and this is a result of climate action, or rather climate change?
Yes. So right now we actually call it the climate crisis because change makes people relax a bit. So we either call it the climate crisis or the climate emergency, meaning that we need to act immediately because of the state we're in at the moment. So some of the impacts of climate change could be, let's just start with economical impacts. We've seen just across the border. Not as a country, as a county, Nairobi County in Kajiado, we're seeing we're having the worst drought in 40 years. We're seeing that, and that is just one of them. We see that we're going to have, if we do not do anything about the current situation, it means that we're going to have more frequent weather disasters. We're going to have droughts are going to be very, very frequent and very, very severe. We're going to have really bad floods. It means that the frequency of floods is going to increase. And it means that the issue of water, the water crisis is going to become very, very bad to the extent that we're going to either die of too much of it or lack of it. It means that because the droughts are going to be so prolonged, it means you're probably going to die of lack of water. And when it rains, it's going to be so severe that it will flood. So it means that it becomes an issue of the water crisis. It goes back to the food issue. We're going to have a food crisis. It goes back to agriculture. It's going to affect our soils, the nutrients. It's going to affect the nutrients in the soil. It means that we're going to have an issue with crop failure. We're going to have starving nations. So it's the issue of climate change becomes a very critical issue. It becomes what we eat. It becomes the air we breathe. It becomes the water we drink. It becomes the clothes that we wear. So it becomes a very, very multidimensional issue. We saw pastoralists selling cattle that were worth 50,000 for 500, and 50 shillings. So we're seeing such kind of losses. That is such. It means that we're going to experience very, 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 very. It's even hard to explain. It's hard to find a word for it. It means that it's going to hit you from what you eat, no water to drink, what you wear, no money to spend. So it's crazy.
All right. So, but anyway, just to get to understand, because maybe this is your line, and when you're doing climate activism, you get to understand that maybe in your research you establish that this group category of people are the people responsible for what we are facing right now. So maybe could you probably just on a light note tell us for what we have seen, what you have experienced is not in Kenya alone, it's across the world. The issue of climate change is affecting every corner of the world. So who are the major contributors to this climate crisis? Who should take much responsibility, in as much as, yes, mitigating the effects of climate change is a collective responsibility, but who are the major contributors to this climate crisis?
Okay, so that just brings me to the point of climate justice and why it's called climate justice.
Right.
So it is that because you find that the least emitters of climate change are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change.
Absolutely.
So you find that the developed countries, the global north, most of the highest emitters are actually found there. When you talk about the United States, when you talk about China, Brazil, Europe, most of them are actually there. And just to mention that, so when we, like I've just mentioned, yes, so those are actually most of the top emitters.
Right.
So we find that we are all in the same boat, but we're in different ships.
Absolutely.
I like to use different analogies. Like I would say, for example, when it's raining, there is this one person who is in their own car, in their own private car, and they see that it's raining, but they're still driving. And there's this other person that is in a public vehicle, in a bus or a matatu, and it's still raining. And there's this other person who has an umbrella and is still walking in the rain. And there's this third person who has nothing. So it's different. The person who's in a private car is experiencing the rain, yes, but they're not feeling it really. The person who's in a bus or a matatu means that they're going to feel it way later when they get off the bus.
Right.
The person who is walking in the rain is actually feeling it, and the only thing that is keeping them from getting wet is the umbrella. And this person who has nothing either has to wait in a shed or walk in the rain. So that's how the climate crisis affects all of us, depending with where you are, with the capacity that you have to adapt to it. That's what determines how much you're going to face the impacts. And that's now where the line is drawn when it comes to vulnerable or frontline communities and how they're really affected by the impacts of climate change.
Right, I really like the analogy, of course, that you're bringing. It's a practical example, and breaking it down to us, making us to understand, because most of us are laymen when it comes to issues of climate change and other topics. So just to note at some point you mentioned that Africa, countries in Africa, we are so vulnerable to effects of climate change, and Africa as a country, not as a country but as a continent, is the least climate resilient region in the world. But as you've mentioned, that the Western countries, where they do a lot of industrialization, being the leading contributors to the climate changes. So maybe just to ask, do you feel that these countries who are leading in issues of climate, the causing agents of climate crisis, are they doing enough in terms of compensation? Because in Africa we are not the leading, but now the adverse effects are felt in Africa. So are they doing enough in terms of compensation and for the loss and damage that they are causing to the rest of the world?
To be honest, no. This is because it goes back to the Kyoto Protocol, which was in 1992. So it stated that the highest emitters should contribute up to 100 billion annually,
right.
And we're still waiting for that. How many years down the line? So it means that there's so much that has to be done. It means that all this time that they were supposed to give those funds, maybe at that time we were supposed to adapt, and that did not happen. So that means that our capability to adapt was just scrapped off. So that means that they're not doing enough in terms of loss and damage. We wouldn't be having these conversations if they're actually doing enough. Well, yes, we agree that there were gaps, because I believe that COP27 this year we're going to have discussions where they're going to actually explain now how exactly these funds are going to come out, and in terms of we're going to have negotiations where if we can have set dates when these funds can come out, so maybe that can move us a step forward. Also, if if we start setting debts, then that means that all these agreements that have not been binding before can now become a little bit binding if we have set debts and if we have the house of how this finance is going to trickle down. But to be honest, for the past, since all these conferences began, we're not getting the kind of support that we need.
All right. So, because actually we have even seen this when our President William Ruto was addressing the world leaders at the UN conference. He was saying that the world leaders should honor the promises that they made of they should fulfill the 12 trillion climate change money that the funds actually that they were supposed to send to the countries that are so vulnerable to these effects of climate action, the climate crisis. So away from that, now that we are having this discussion of the COP27, where a lot of negotiations is ongoing, and we hope that we're really just anticipating that there will be good deals that probably will benefit us as Africans. So in terms of negotiations and studying the nature of how things are in Africa, what do you feel should be given priority when they're negotiating for deals with the Western countries? What are some of the sectors where they should, African really, because this COP27 has been named as the African COP. So which areas should they really give priority in the negotiations?
I think the first area that should be given priority is especially the net zero emissions. So we want a just transition. We believe there are systems, and that's why we're saying a just transition. So we want a transition. That is what we can say. We want a transition. We want a fossil-free energy sector, because that is the beginning of this all. That is where this all began, and that is where it all continues to get worse. So if you can have an energy sector that is prioritizing renewable energy rather than really depending on fossil fuels, which are non-renewable and they are the highest in terms of emissions, then we can make a very big step forward towards cutting our global emissions. If Africa, especially, I'm taking this from the speech that our president said yesterday about us transiting to clean energy. So Africa, which is like the most vulnerable, is trying to do this. Then it calls out for the rest of the world. We've seen the Russia-Ukraine war and how the whole world was affected just because of overdependence on fossil fuels. So it's actually expensive. Because when you talk about renewable energy, the initial phases might be expensive, but eventually it becomes really, really cheap. So when we start to learn from hard lessons like this, then it's also very, very clear that we need that shift. So that is the first thing. The next thing is we need to acknowledge that the climate crisis is here with us. And you need to acknowledge that there are people who've been affected. There are people who've lost their lives. There are people who've lost their livelihoods. It's one thing when you're telling someone to adapt. If you're going to work and you're told to adapt, it's different. You can decide to walk to work, get a bicycle to work, get a cab or public transport to work. But it's another thing when you've lost your inheritance, when you've lost the land that you're supposed to inherit. It's another thing when you wanted to inherit the farming family business and crops are failing. It's different. That kind of loss and damage it's hard to explain. It's even hard to say that it's hard to quantify in terms of money. So we also need to push for climate reparations, and it should not come in terms of donations. It's like for what you've lost, and it can't even be quantified. It can't be enough. So that's another thing that we need to push for. We need to push for climate finance. For where we can adapt, we need to adapt. For where we can mitigate, especially for the developed countries, they should definitely mitigate. So those are the things that I feel we should push for.
All right, interesting. Now, it's good, of course, you're telling us about, actually this conversation in the COP27 is just revolving around fossil-free economy, where people should, get away from the fossil fuels and adopt, is it to adapt or to adopt the green and renewable energy? So, just on our personal capacity as Africans and Kenyans who are listening to this conversation and of course following on the COP27, how can we join hands, in pushing for climate action to ensure that just for posterity, the things that we are doing will benefit us in the near future, trying our best to cut it to zero emissions to ensure that moving forward we are going to have a nation and a world at large that is safe for everyone from these issues and crises that we have just witnessed that are pertaining to the climate change.
This just goes back to our current president, His Excellency Honorable Mr. William Ruto. He is the chair of the Committee of African Heads of State and Governments on Climate Change. So through such a committee, we see that there is potential for us to work together, because we realize that in this climate crisis, you cannot work alone. Say, for example, we see a country like South Africa, which is still in Africa, the whole of Africa, it's actually the top emitter. So we can't say that the whole of Africa is doing something except that one country. So this comes in when we start to work together, when we start to realize that we have potential to actually transit to cleaner energy. According to his speech, the president said that we have the capacity to produce 20 megawatts of wind energy and gigawatts of wind energy and 10 of geothermal energy. That is 30 gigawatts. And not to mention solar energy. And being countries, we have a lot of countries that are within the equator. It means that we receive a lot of sunshine and we have a lot of potential for solar energy. So it means that if we all work together and realize that we have so much resources to transit to energy that is clean and that would put us in a better place in terms of the future, then I feel like if we work together, I think that has to be the first thing. We need to work together. We need to work collaboratively to come up with solutions, to come up with agreements, to agree on things, on solutions that can move us forward. And I believe that if we come together as Africa, then we can be able to achieve that.
All right. Really, really interesting. Of course, great insight we're getting from you concerning the climate action. And this is a conversation that we want to roll it and continue with it, not just to the end of this COP27, but later on we shall be having more and more of such discussion. Of course, we still need your input on this. I'm not giving you a chance to make your final remarks because you've just summed it up in a superb way. So, yeah, that's it for the interview on climate action.